What's going on, y'all? We're back live here at Justicefighter Radio Saturday morning here on Hits 92.3, the real definition of internet radio. And it's been an interesting week. It's been a lot going on, a lot that has made the news, and a lot that we're going to talk about. But I ran into one of my good esteemed friends in the association earlier this week, and he was talking about the global climate change crisis. And I wanted to bring him on to bring him to you guys so we can update you in real time on what's happening. So I want to introduce to some and reintroduce to others Major James Woodall, one of the legends already in the struggle, a young man in his own right, but he is making moves on a major scale for social justice here in Georgia. And it's just an honor to have you on Justicefighter Radio. Introduce yourself to the people.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon, or good morning, rather. Like you said, my name is James Major Woodall, and I'm here in Georgia.
Yeah. So tell them what you've been working on.
So just a few things. Currently, I'm in the race to become the next state conference president for the Georgia NAACP, as well as a student at the Interdenominational Theological Center, which is the Black Ecumenical Center for the Christian tradition here in this country. And one of the things that makes us so different is that we focus on these issues in regards to our faith claims, our authentic faith claims, and how we use our understanding of God to describe what's taking place here in these communities across this world. So I'm excited to discuss these issues because they are so relevant to our time and our experience and our conditions here, and I just look forward to it.
Yeah, and I mean, some of the work you've been doing is just phenomenal. You just told me you just got back from New York, where they were having the global conversation on the crisis that is happening in our climate. And I want you to kind of just tell the people what it was like in New York and what the real conversation is right now.
Right. So last week, we got there Friday. We got there Friday, and the United Nations Climate Summit was that following Monday. And we had a lot of the organizing groups. We had Fridays for Future and groups like that who were protesting across the country and across the world. There were millions of people in hundreds of countries talking about climate and what can we do to push the envelope, what can we do to hold countries, nations, institutions, organizations, corporations accountable. And so there have been conversation over the past few years about what we can do as a collective to bring some bring some resolve to what's going on. And then at this, they call it COP. And so they'll go across various countries and highlight the issues that are going on within those communities. This year they'll be going to, I believe, Chile. And they were talking about how the Chilean experience is different than, say, in the global south. Well, Chile is in the global south, but more so in the African, context than in the American context. So how can we bring resources? How can we bring resolve? How can we bring restitution and reparation for some of the damages that have been caused as a result of capitalist policies? And so that was a very interesting dynamic to see protesters from all over the world come together and convene in a space talking about how we can bring some resolve to these issues. I specifically remember being in a room where there were Chilean, Peruvian, English, French, American, like everybody from all over the place, all over the world coming together talking about what can we do to work together. And one of the interesting dynamics that I found was that it was not a lot of people of color, specifically black folk, in that room. And so how does this issue impact our communities, which we all know disproportionately impact people of color, black folks, and poor people? How can we use this as an opportunity to engage that space? And that's something I'm very much so interested in doing moving forward. Definitely.
And so what we want the people to know is that, start yesterday, there was a global protest. And so this is from theguardiannews.com. 6 million people have taken to the streets over the past week, uniting across time zones, cultures, generations to demand urgent action on the escalating ecological emergency. A fresh wave of climate strikes swept the globe on Friday, with an estimated 2 million people walking out of schools and workplaces. Organizers say that during the weeks of protests that began with a global climate strike last week, a total of 6 million people, from trade unionists to school children, have taken part in thousands of towns and cities. This week is a demonstration of the power of our movement, said a spokesperson for Friday for Future Group, which has helped coordinate the demonstrations. People power is more powerful than the people in power. It's the biggest ever climate mobilization, and it's only the beginning. The momentum is on our side, and we're not going anywhere. On Friday, there were huge protests in Italy where more than 1 million people were reported to have taken part. Spain, the Netherlands, New Zealand, and more than 3.5% of the country's population joined in the demonstrations. Organizers said they're expecting more people to join as the day progressed. Huge turnouts were expected in Canada, where Greta Thunberg, who kickstarted the school strike movement with a solo protest in Sweden 12 months ago, was due to join the demonstrators in Montreal. And so we see a lot of energy around the world, but how can we best educate, Black and brown folks in the United States on the need to join this movement? Because, like you said, we are one of the most impacted communities, and we are not at the table. So how do you think they can help be educated on this issue and make it plain for the climate crisis, the ecological crisis that's happening in Black and brown communities?
Well, I think it's not a one-way answer, of course. I think one of the ways we can do it is one thing that most people of color have is a faith claim of some sort. Mm-hmm. And to have the faith traditions speak to these issues in a way that is communicable to them. One of the ways that I do it is, we all say, let everything that has breath praise the Lord. Mm-hmm. But if you can't breathe, you can't praise the Lord. So therefore, if you can't breathe, God ain't getting what God has created you to do.
So true.
Everybody can relate to that, regardless if you believe in God or not, right? That to understand that the world we live in was a gift to humanity. Mm-hmm. It's a universal understanding. And we were created to not destroy it, but to look over it, to preserve it, to make sure that it's okay. And so when the earth itself is starting to purge itself of human beings, not the earth killing itself, but the earth is going to still be here. Mm-hmm. Humanity is what we're trying to preserve. And so the real crisis, or in a real sense, the focus has to be on how do we engage these corporations, these governmental institutions, these nonprofits to really build infrastructure that not necessarily stops it, because I don't know if we can stop it. Scientists have argued that fact, but rather can we slow it down? Mm-hmm. And so the benchmark is about, right now they say we have about 1.2 Celsius global warming. That's where we're at. If we get between 2 and 3 degrees Celsius, that's when it becomes irreversible. Again, that is argued among scientists, but that's just the conversation that's been taking place. I'm not a scientist. I'm a clergy, mm-hmm. but this is just what I'm hearing, what I'm reading about this issue. So, and the other thing is we have to listen to Black activists mm-hmm. who are here in these spaces. We got to lift up their work. We don't have to necessarily be the one at the mic all the time talking about these issues. Lift their work up. And not only listen to the Gretas, even the Gretas are great, activists. We have young Black women and young Black sisters and even young Black men who are talking about these issues. Let's lift their work up as well. Mm-hmm. We have one in the NAACP, Jackie Patterson, who is the Climate and Environmental Justice Director for the national organization. And let's lift her up. Let's support her. Let's get these people everything that they need so that they can lift up their work, and we can make sure that we make a lasting impact on this issue.
Definitely. And I think people need to understand that this is a local issue as well as a national issue and a global issue. We were having a conversation about electric power poles being placed in low-income communities and people not understanding the radiation effect that's causing cancer, things like that. Of course, the Flint water crisis, which we also have a water crisis here in Atlanta, Georgia, in the Vine City, English Avenue area. So when we start talking about this, it's all of these things that are affecting the community and lowering their way of life. It's affecting their way of life and killing people in real time. And so we're not just talking about the polar ice caps melting and the seawater rising and then causing all of the severe typhoons and hurricanes, but we're talking about all of those manifestations that are occurring in our community. That's why we have to have this conversation. What do you think?
I'll also say, like, when we talk about solutions, everybody's like, well, I know it's an issue, but how do we solve it? Mm-hmm. And when we face environmental crisis, we like to frame it in three ways. and I can't take credit for this, but it was genius, and so I stole it, right?
Okay.
There's three ways that you describe how we engage this conversation of, okay, we have the issue, what's the solution? One is, the gentleman described it as loss and damage finance. Speak the language that they're speaking in those spaces. Loss and damage finance talks about reparations, but in a very civil way, because if you have a climate emergency, and say for instance hurricane, what was the latest hurricane in the Bahamas?
Dorian.
Exactly. Yeah. So the entire coast of the Grand Bahama Island, as well as there was another one, Abaco Island, right? You have 600 people missing right now. I think it was about 50 of them that were already pronounced deceased and dead. And so after that, after the mortality rate, then you have a disruption of the economic base of that country, which was tourism, which is resorts and those kinds of things. But then you have opportunities where you have farming and you have everyday ways of life that are disrupted as well. And so how do you replace those things? And now people say, well, you have insurance and things like that. But the reality of it is the reason why some of these hurricanes and these storm systems are becoming so strong is the fact that the Great Barrier Reef has been disrupted.
Yes.
And that serves as a natural barrier to some of these things, and they literally absorb the energy of these storms. And so therefore when it comes and hits, the coasts, they're not as strong. But over the last few years, what we've seen is that every time that happens, it becomes the greatest storm ever, right? And so we have to be very confident that the approach that we take not only impacts the businesses, but also it is helping the communities that are needed the most, because the entire island was underwater. Yeah. People are I remember reading reports that they said the entire public sphere smelled like dead bodies.
Dead bodies. Yeah, 70% of the island, Grand Bahama, was underwater. And so these are just examples of the repercussions of the climate crisis. Like he was saying, the effects on the barrier reef, both reefs, have been so devastating that they cannot absorb the strength of these storms. And these storms are becoming stronger and stronger. We've had, 5 Category 5s since President Trump has taken office? That's unheard of. Katrina was a 4 when it made landfall. We're talking about 5s. The last one I can think of was Andrew, that cut across Florida and just flattened Homestead. So when you start having these real conversations about, the climate crisis, let's just be real. It's not just a majority community issue. This is a minority community issue as well, because we are taking the brunt. We don't have clean water. We don't have clean air. We don't have, some communities don't even have trees. And so when we start having this conversation about where power companies are going to be built, they're always built in the low-income communities. And like Plant Vogel with the potash, I remember having that conversation for such a long time. If you don't know what that is, it's the biological debris that is created by these nuclear power plants that was being dumped directly into the water, and the water basin was being polluted. So these are real issues that are being ignored by a lot of our politicians, and we as a people have to make sure we're educated properly. So kind of talk about, what was the global conversation in New York about how they wanted to stem the tide as much as they can.
For sure. And before I get to that point, though, I want to make something very, very make it hit home. The reason why a lot of our children have asthma.
Yes.
The reason why a lot of our children are not able to really be still, as we say, in school. The reason why we have food insecurity and food deserts is not just because of white supremacy.
Yes.
Well, it is white supremacy.
It's a lot of white supremacy.
But not because the white men don't want us to, get what we want to get. It's because we have designed our society. We have designed our society to put these people in these positions systematically. In New Orleans, for example, or Louisiana, for example, Lake Pontchartrain, right? When it floods, the Army Corps of Engineers, what they do is they try to redirect the water so that they put it into Lake Pontchartrain. But what happens when there's a major storm surge? Then it goes somewhere. There was a report that dolphins started to arise and show up dead in the lake. Why? Because there are toxins in there. There different pollutants in there, and so it not only affects people, but it affects the ecology and the systems abroad as well, and it impacts our people.
Yes.
Because that's the economy, that's our food, that's our livelihoods.
Well, let's talk about this. Most of the low-income communities are built in floodplains.
Right.
So when the water rises, that's where the first place the water is going to go, and then they don't rebuild. So these are important conversations that must be had. But you were going to say something.
Yes. So regarding the UN Climate Summit last week, these are just some of the things that came out as announcements. France announced that it would not enter into any trade agreement with countries that have not, ratified the Paris Accord, which
we just pulled out of.
Exactly. The United States is not a part of the Paris Agreement. Germany's committed to carbon neutrality by 2050, which some would argue that that's not enough. We need carbon neutrality now.
Well, explain to the people what carbon neutrality is.
Carbon neutrality is simply, in layman's terms, zero emissions, zero carbon emissions by corporations, businesses at any point in time.
Okay.
All right. 12 countries made financial commitments to the Green Climate Fund, the official financial mechanism to assist developing countries in adaptation and mitigation practices to counter climate change. The United Kingdom made additional contribution, doubling its overall pledge. China said it would cut emissions by over 12 billion tons annually and will pursue a path of higher quality growth and low carbon development. I would also like to mention this, that on unprecedented levels of private sector action, a group of the largest asset owners in the world, responsible for directing more than $2 trillion in investment, they committed to move to carbon neutral investment portfolios by 2050. Okay. Meaning, again, our businesses are not going to be emitting carbon into the atmosphere. Yeah. 87 major companies with a combined market capitalization of over $2.3 trillion pledged to reduce emissions and align their businesses with what scientists say is indeed to limit the worst impacts of climate change, a 1.5 Celsius degrees future. Another 130 banks, one-third of the global banking sector, signed to align their businesses with the Paris Agreement goals. Michael Bloomberg would increase the funding and geographic spread of his coal phase-out efforts to 30 countries. He's already closed 297 of the 530 coal plants in the United States. Granted, Trump
saying he's going to bring back
clean coal, but the guys who got the money say, I'm about to close the coal. So just be careful and be aware of that as we talk about the Wall Street piece to this.
Well, I think here's what a lot of people don't really understand. You know, when Trump makes statements like that, he's appealing to an older generation. But, you know, the younger generation who is going to inherit the earth when we're not here, they are the ones that are on the forefront because they want clean air, clean water, and clean places to live that are not polluted. And so how do we get the older generation to understand that coal mines and coal factories are going the way of the dinosaurs?
Well, it's a comprehensive conversation that has to be had. One is, you know, there are conversations around the Green New Deal and people are saying, well, it's going to take jobs away from people. Well, we have to be very comprehensive in our approach and in our conversation because the Green New Deal, though I might not personally agree with all of it, we have to change the nuance of what's being said about it because it not only says, okay, we're going to take coal or fossil fuels, because it's not just coal, but we're going to take fossil fuels as our support for it decreases because we know what impact it does to the communities that we serve. Let's take it to clean energy, right? Renewable energy. And how can we do that? So we have to redefine that conversation in a way that's beneficial, but also just make it plain. You know, you can't afford to spend thousands of dollars on health care. We already had that conversation about lack of access to health care, but you already can't afford.
Exactly.
So if we're going to continue to allow the capitalist mindset to dictate what we do as communities, then we're going to continue to see our people die.
Yeah, and I think it's a messaging problem. You know, our people are visual people, and when you break it down and make it plain that if we don't change the way we invest, more children will have asthma, more infant mortality rates will increase. We will not see clean air. It'll be smog. If people remember Atlanta in the 80s, it was a cloud that hovered over the city. So when you start making it plain like that, they can understand. Because I think a lot of people are lost in the wording and the messaging. And I think if we simplify it, they would understand.
For sure, the message has to be there, but the content of that message has to be there as well. And I think that's something that we oftentimes get lost. How do we define that point of conversation that not only just looks by us and seeks to include us, but actually engages the reality of our condition as well? That's just something to keep in mind. So
okay. And so what did they say the next steps were? I know we are in the middle of a bunch of rallies and protests. Let me just highlight one that was here in Atlanta. This is from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Last week's climate rally in downtown Atlanta gave way Friday to climate protests that saw nearly 20 arrests as demonstrators attempted to block some of Metro Atlanta's busiest streets. The protests, organized by Extinction Rebellion Atlanta, part of the international movement to fight climate change through direct action and civil disobedience, drew 200 people who stopped traffic on Peachtree and Buckhead near 10th Street and Peachtree in Midtown. According to police, 19 people were arrested during the climate protest. It says the event capped a week of international protests around 150 countries, thousands of locations, including across the state of Georgia. Designed to coincide with the UN's United Nations Climate Action Summit, protesters hope to create awareness about climate change and urge lawmakers to take action. Climate change is the product of our own miscalculations, said Laura Wetley, 18, a student at Georgia State University and first-time protester, along with her friend Diana Antone, who's 19. We have to be active about it, Antone said. This is our future. In Metro Atlanta, the demonstration included a September 20th youth-led protest by Greta Thunberg, the 16-year-old Swedish activist, in which about 200 students and adults rallied at the steps of the state capitol. A number of smaller protests have taken place in Metro Atlanta, K through 12 schools and campuses throughout the week. Friday's demonstration was specifically planned as an act of civil disobedience. So we see that people are definitely engaged. We see small pockets of protesters who are becoming more and more bold and getting in good trouble. But what do you think the takeaway should be as far as moving forward?
So moving forward, I want to be very clear, because they made sure that I was very clear that Fridays for Future specifically said we're not going to just have a one protest, opportunity. We're going to continue to protest every Friday until something changes, right?
Nice.
Now, as far as here locally in Georgia, I'm not sure about the Fridays for Future here in Georgia. I haven't made that connection, but I will say that we have to have conversations with not only our General Assembly, but with the governor and with the private sector. There are three approaches that we can use to possibly help on the state level. Is cap and trade, carbon tax, and just the environmental justice movement as a whole. What cap and trade does is it basically sets a upper limit on emissions.
Okay.
Any business that comes into this state, you have to agree that you will not have any emissions going forward. Point blank. The second one is the carbon tax. Under the carbon tax, the government will set a price that emitters must pay for each ton of emissions that they emit. So you begin to put a price on how much this is impacting the atmosphere. You make them pay for it, because what's happening is either they pay for it now or everybody pays for it later. Now, some people would argue that is a regressive tax, which in some ways it is, because people who are less able to fund that or be able to pay for it becomes a burden on them. So people say, well, it's going to cost you about $25 more in gas because you're no longer able to just have unleaded gasoline. And so those kinds of conversations are being had, but we need to look at it creatively. And then just the environmental justice piece. Talk to the companion regulators about types of pollutants, how they directly affect the local community, and make sure that those things are reducing, the gas emissions at the lowest cost, and that which would allow us to do more and do it faster and quicker and more efficiently. And those are just the three ways that really we're able to, as a community, to be able to address this issue on a local level. Because, again, the burden lies not on the people. Because the people didn't create...
They didn't create this problem.
They didn't create the infrastructure and the systems of capitalism that ultimately pushes this into a conversation of, well, how much money is it? But I will say this. If we show these companies that it's going to cost them way more money, and it's going to tap into their profit margins and their bottom line, that this climate crisis is going to cost you more in the long run, of course they're going to be more liable to buy in. Why? Because now it affects their bottom line. So let's talk about it in that sense, as opposed to well, the science says this, and if we don't do anything about it, then we're going to all die. The apocalypse was coming.
Yeah.
They're looking at us like we crazy.
Yeah, we got the little...
Right, which is okay because I am a little crazy, but at the end of the day, we trying to get something pushed. We're trying to get an agenda realized. And so that's one way, one creative approach that we can look at the climate conversation.
So we don't need to put the tinfoil hats on our head. No? Okay. And I think people need to understand that this really affects us. So this was a report from Channel 2 News back in July. If you remember, there is the Synergetics Plant out in Smyrna.
Yes.
And so this is the report. Officials at one local medical sterilization plant told lawmakers that they would install technology to reduce the toxic emissions after an explosive report revealed it's releasing cancer-causing chemicals for years without residents' knowledge. The Synergetics Plant off Atlanta Road is one of two plants highlighted in a recent WebMD investigation by reporters. There are a pair of plants which at the Smyrna address and the BD Board plant in Covington have released the chemical ethyl oxide affecting 3 census tracts bordering Buckhead, Vining, Smyrna, and Covington neighborhoods. The chemical poses elevated cancer risks over a lifetime. The researcher said she's been researching the issue for about a year, and last week's report was released. It has prompted an investigation which was read in the Chicago Tribune. So this is happening in real time right here in Metro Atlanta. They were releasing toxic toxins that cause cancer from this plant, and nobody really knew about it. So when people say, oh, environmental justice doesn't really affect me, I mean, if you live in Covington, if you live in Smyrna, if you live in Vinings, if you live in Buckhead, that's just one example of how this issue affects you and your children directly. So I think we just have to always ground this conversation in, yeah, it affects you, yours, and everybody else, because, people are really me, my, and I. And so that's why I think it's important. But I appreciate, the information that you are bringing, because it's definitely needed for the listeners. So what else do you think people need to know? I know you do a lot of work in the General Assembly. I know we're coming back up on that time. January is fast approaching. What do you think people need to do to reach out to their legislators to make them understand this is the first priority for our people to deal with this growing climate crisis?
I think they should call them and have a conversation with them, but I also believe that there needs to be a Black Climate Summit here in Atlanta.
Definitely.
And we have these conversations as a community about what specific ways can we not only address it, but can we acknowledge what's taking place within our communities? Because if we don't understand where we hurt, we can't heal. And so let's identify where we're hurting, allows for space for that to happen, but then also come out with some real ways that we can actually begin to heal. And if we're not able to do that, then I don't think we're going to have much of an impact on that global conversation. And I think Atlanta can lead that movement in conjunction with so many others who are also doing that work.
Okay. And so, James, you just been doing so much work in this space and other spaces. How can people keep up with what you're doing? And because I want to be a part of this Black Climate Summit, which we hopefully going to be planning real soon. But how can people stay up to date on what you're doing? And I know you said that you were running for president of the state conference. I want you to talk about that a little bit.
For sure. So one, you all can follow me on social media. I'm very transparent about all of the things that I'm doing. And it's very from a personal standpoint. It's not trying to put on, act like I'm bigger than life itself. I'm just a regular person out here caring about so many of these issues. My social media is at IMajorWish, IMAJOR, Wish, WISH, or on Facebook at just James Woodall. And I talk about these issues, put up blog posts, put up articles, and give my commentary, and invite the public in my network to discuss and dialogue amongst each other. And I'm very intentional about having such a diverse group of friends. People say, well, why you have this person on your page? Or why you have... It's because I need all personalities, all backgrounds, all outlooks of life, so that I can come to some type of consensus as to what is the best outcome going forward. I believe that's what leadership is all about. Now, I'll also say this. The Georgia NAACP, like I said, we have Jackie Patterson, who is our national director for environmental justice. climate and environmental justice. And if elected, or even if not elected, the NAACP needs to have some priority on these issues because it impacts colored people, Negroes, black folk, right?
It impacts Negroes.
So when elected, that's going to be a major focus. But I'm also aware that a lot of people who are not necessarily in this conversation, they're not as concerned about it.
Yeah.
So we need to go around this state and talk to them about some of the issues that they're having as it relates to environment, and maybe they might not become a part of the quote-unquote climate justice movement.
Yes.
But as long as they are aware of what's taking place, they can be able to identify some of these things and how they move their communities forward. I'm okay with that.
Okay. Leave
the organizing to those who are more concerned about it and take it to the General Assembly. But also that I believe that it impacts poverty, it impacts healthcare, it impacts education. So it's a very holistic approach to how we engage, and that's what the NAACP is modeled to do, is to talk about those six, as we call them, the six game changers. And it might not be environmental justice for you, but it might be education. So how does education impact and influence and inform your everyday condition? You know what I mean? So that's what, the NAACP part of it is. But regardless of what happens in that election, this work still has to be done, and over my dead body, I'm going to make sure it's done.
And that's what you've been doing. I mean, we've known each other, almost 5 years now? And I've seen you put the work in on the ground, and I appreciate that. And regardless of what happens in the association, we have to continue this work and continue to move it forward. And I think one of the things you hit on that a lot of people don't realize is it's important in organizing to have an organization where you can, channel that energy. A lot of people are doing a lot of work in a lot of different spaces, but we all got to organize. We don't have to come under one flag, but we need to organize. That way we have a united front. And so that's why I wanted to bring you on the platform to engage and educate the people, because a lot of brown and black folks not really having this conversation because they worried about putting food on the table and clothes on their back. But they need to understand that the reason why a lot of the things they face are happening is because of this global climate crisis that we're in. The reason why we have to mobilize for Houston and mobilize for New Orleans and mobilize for the Bahamas and Puerto Rico is because of global warming. It's because the fact that the ocean is warming and these storms are getting stronger. That's why I believe I saw last week 12 humpback whales, not humpback, they were regular whales, washed up on the shore in Savannah. That's a problem when you have wildlife that is showing you that something's happening to the climate. The fact that it's September the 27th and we're still in the 90s, that's a problem. So we need to have these conversations in real time so people can understand what's really going on. So what we're going to do right now, we're going to take a break and we'll go back to the music for a little while, and we're right back here on Justicefighter Radio with James Woodall. We're going to continue the conversation.